My name is Dmitry Pal. This is Andrew Nelson, senior consultant for Red Hat for identity management and other things. Today we will be talking about path to success with your identity management deployment. So before we dive into the details of this conversation, and we really want it to be an interactive conversation because this is for you to learn and to exchange experience and to understand what kind of challenges are there and how to avoid them. So this is the marketing slide that we inserted. So please come to booth. We can continue conversations there. We want to know who you are and where are you with your identity management story. So just who knows about identity management? Wow. Okay, wow. Good. So who hasn't done anything with it? Like no production, no POC, just okay.
Cool.
Okay. So who has done POC but not running production yet? Okay. And who is running production? Good.
Nice.
So we have a very diverse audience here. Hopefully the content will be helpful for everybody, and we can continue conversations later. So we want to set expectations straight. This is not a conversation about features of identity management. This is not going to be a demo, and we probably won't go through all the slides that we have in the slide deck. So there are about 50 slides in there, and they are created so that you can read them later.
And Dmitry and I will also be later on down at the booth to answer any other IDM questions and talk about these things in greater detail if you want to as well. So please come and join us and ask other questions there in addition.
Okay. And what are the goals of this? Really to share the experience about the identity management deployments at different phases and help you understand what to watch for, what to avoid, what kind of problems are there or will be there or you are heading to, and how to avoid them. This is a conversation starter. We might have missed in this presentation some things that you have or will encounter. So this is a way of exchanging information. So we need feedback, we need your comments, we need your input.
And, and in general, IDM has also improved a lot over the years from customer feedback and support. In my experience as a consultant working in the field, the engineering team has been very responsive to that feedback and support, and the IDM product has definitely improved for it, but we always want to make it better.
So there is a follow-up conversation. There is a round table at 1 o'clock in Moscone South 308. There is room for about 30 people to join. So if you are interested in having a face-to-face conversation between people who already deployed identity management and have some experiences with it, sharing those experiences, so you're welcome to join. Moving on to phases. Yep. So let's talk about phases. Do you want to cover the?
Yeah. So initially, you've heard about IDM. You're thinking, let's maybe have a look at it. After this, or some of you that have never used it before want to go out and look at it. So the first is kind of the discovery, learning about it, learning about some of the tips and tricks, pitfalls. Then you're going to move on into your POC. Usually in your lab environments. Understand some of the pitfalls that you may have looked at, maybe determine some of the things you would have wanted to do differently if you do it in production, and then rolling it out into production as you go through. And then, of course, the day two, the operational side of things of what you're going to want to think about after you've actually put it in production and so forth.
So we will start with the discovery piece. And this discovery piece starts with a very simple use case, so user story. So I just wanted to try this thing. I heard about it. I wanted to try. So where do I start? I will probably just download packages and try the install. And the first experience might be that it failed. Mm-hmm. And the first experience is like, why? I'm trying the software and it is failing to install. That's bad software. That's bad user experience. So people get very bad taste from the first attempt because they don't know what are the expectations of the software and what actual impact this software will have on the system that they're installing it on.
And you'll also understand that at the end why we kind of say don't necessarily install it on your workstation or your laptop necessarily or your machine. Find a sandbox machine to go and install it on, because as you'll learn, those expectations can be pretty substantial and often in areas that people don't think about until they have done their POC. And so we're going to try and get you to think about those things a little earlier in the process.
So one of the things that we will be talking about a lot through the course of this presentation is DNS. Mm-hmm. So DNS is a very important part of identity management because everything is rotating around the resolution of the identities. And identity and DNS go hand in hand. So the system has assumptions about DNS. And if these assumptions, some of the basic assumptions, are not met, the installation might fail. So what are the assumptions? The assumptions are that services are resolvable through DNS, right? Whatever you want to address or talk to, there is a way of asking DNS, I want to talk to this service, here is its name, and get back information how to talk to that service. So that means that you don't configure these services or knowledge about these services explicitly in the client software, right? Mm-hmm. So this is an assumption, right? You can override this assumption and you can configure things inside clients. But by default, system assumes that you don't want to do that and won't do that, and that DNS is the way of resolving hosts and services. So that means that properly configured DNS is crucial, and system comes with its own DNS. So you might use it, you might not use it. So if you install IDM with DNS, it becomes its own DNS server and serves its own DNS zone by default. Mm-hmm. So if you don't connect this DNS zone to your real environment that you have that system in, it's an isolated system. It doesn't know anything about the rest of your environment. Mm-hmm. So you might have some challenges accessing it and working with it because it's completely isolated by itself. Right? So and the IDM itself provides the services and lives inside this zone. So nothing outside, unless you connected DNS, knows about what IDM provides. So if you installed something on your test system and then try to get from outside, the outside world doesn't know anything unless you connected things. So when you install, you really need to think about that. You really need to understand that you're bringing in a new DNS zone effectively on that specific system, whatever VM box it's going to be. And what is going to be its host name, what DNS zone it's going to serve. Are you going to use the DNS provided by IDM, or you're going to leverage some other DNS zone that is provided by some other DNS server that you have in the environment?
Yeah. One other thing also is you kind of hear we're talking a lot about DNS. One of the things that you'll see as we go deeper and deeper into the other components, DNS is central to a lot of IDM because fully qualified domains, names are also centrally important into IDM. That resolution of FQDN information to the host or to the other components is critical, especially when you get into PKI, which is a major component to IDM, and then later on as you start to get into Realm Trust within Kerberos and a few other those components. So DNS is often a stumbling block of customers when they first look at it, hemming and hawing for a lot of times. I've been at customer sites where they want to put this into Active Directory, and where do we fit it within Active Directory, and our hosts are actually already existing in their domain name, and so there's a lot of different things to think about, but DNS is a central core component, and don't be afraid to spend some time thinking about it, and as you do your POC, you may come back and say, no, we did it wrong in the POC, and that's a normal process too.
Right. So before we move forward, one other thing to mention in here is IPv6.
Yep.
So system doesn't require IPv6 to be configured.
Yep.
But system requires IPv6 to be enabled in kernel.
And you guys are using CIS benchmarks for system hardening. So all of you basically, according to the default CIS benchmarks, will be disabling IPv6 by default. So you're basically now going to have an exception to the CIS benchmark to enable IPv6 on your IDM server. It does not need to be enabled on your client systems or anywhere else, but it just needs to be enabled and configured for local hosts essentially, but at a default enabled only on the IDM servers.
So, and the reason why it is in there is because if you have IPv6 configured in kernel, then the libraries that do the analysis and detection of the available networks work properly. And you don't need to have IPv6, but the software assumes that you get the right results and correct results out of the libraries. Because if you don't enable that, you get wrong responses from the libraries, and the installation will fail.
Yep.
Moving forward. So the recommendation is really to choose the realm and host names properly. Make sure that you have two parts inside the name, because then later some of the parts of the system might not work properly if you install just with a single real name. Then we'd recommend using IDM DNS when you install it for the first trial. You'd not necessarily need to use it in general in your future deployments, but just to get a taste, it might make sense to have it enabled. And configure forwarders so that it is integrated with your DNS infrastructure.
So one also thing to notice, when you install the integrated DNS service within IDM, it will auto-populate a lot of the auto-discovery components that the IDM client systems will use, the SRV records, the TXT entry for the realm name. And so that's information that you'll want to then look up as you move forward, maybe if you were to use an Infoblox appliance later on. Those are entries you're going to need to manually place into your Infoblox system, and so you'll be able to look them up directly within IDM as it will auto-populate correctly for you. And so it's a good point of reference as well.
So the next part to think about is PKI aspects of your deployment. So identity management comes with the CA that you can use, and the assumption is that you might not be using certificates now, but would be interested in using PKI infrastructure in future for your Linux clients and applications and services running as a part of your Linux infrastructure. For example, provisioning certificates for your OpenStack or OpenShift or other parts of the infrastructure. So CA is there, and it is there by default, and it is available for you, so we think that it is the right default. There are a couple different options. So you can install with this CA. You can install without CA, but then you need to provide some certificates from some other external CA during the installation. Or you can chain to the existing CA. And when you go later into POCs and other phases, this is something to think about and evaluate whether you want to chain or not.
The one thing to also note, in my experience working with customers in the field installing this is the one policy area where you're going to find the largest stumbling blocks. This is going to be the one non-technical area that has the greatest impact in many of the components of IDM. When we talk about IDM, we also talk about kind of fork-in-the-road decisions at install time. This is one of the major ones, whether no CA, sub-CA, or standalone CA. For your initial POC, for your first time to play with it, please just use the internal CA. It just makes your life a lot simpler. But as you start to get more experience with it and look to go into production, can be cognizant of your organizational policies that you may have, especially around security and so forth. I've been in environments where the Active Directory is the CA server of record for the corporation, and so we need to essentially work with the Active Directory team to submit a sub-CA request for IDM to then get the CA, which then goes against a whole bunch of policies. They don't want to allow anyone to issue certificates based on their chain, and so that brings forth a conversation with them and a dialogue, and so that may take a little extra time than you think and you realize, but the earlier you can start those conversations, the better it makes it for you as you become more and more familiar with it.
Okay, thank you. One other thing that I want to draw your attention to is, okay, you managed to install it, you connected your browser, you authenticated, you see the UI, and in this process you had to accept the certificate issued by IDM CA, because it is a self-signed certificate, so it's a new root. It's not in your browser trust store yet, so you would have to click through exception. And you click through the exception and everything worked, and you are now in the UI. So, and you play with it and everything seems fine, but then you kill this VM or rebuild this system and you try it again. And you try it again, and this time it doesn't ask you for the exception, it just fails. And what happens is, in your trust store, you're already trusting the certificate for the installation of IDM, but it is the old one, and the keys do not match. But if you installed with the same DN or and the serial numbers start from 1 again. So you are effectively having the same certificate but with a different key. And people like, why is it not working? Well, clean your trust store and accept the new certificate again.
So there's a couple of things we'll talk about later on that you can do to kind of help mitigate some of these challenges. This can also be a challenge if in your lab environment you use the same domain and realm name that you use in your production environment, and the workstation that you sit on has access to both environments, but both of those two environments don't communicate to each other. We actually had this at a customer site where their lab and their prod were the exact same domain name, and we'll talk about the ways to kind of help mitigate that one and some best ideas in that regard.
Yeah. So the recommendations on the PKI side is use the defaults, but be aware of what the options are, and clean the browser when you do reinstall. So be aware that this is the cause of the experience that you might have. So another thing is authentication. So when you install IDM, it takes control of the system so that the system becomes a member of itself. Of the domain. So if you had some configuration of the authentication that belonged to some other central system like Active Directory or LDAP or whatever it was, that's all wiped out. So if you are doing it on your laptop, you might have just done damage for yourself. So that might lead to hard serious recovery. So just be aware that a lot of like PAM stack, NSS stack, Kerberos configuration, SSSD, everything is reconfigured on the system when you install IP.
And that also goes for third-party utilities that you may have installed that do identity management and have PAM, their own custom PAM modules, and in some cases custom kernel modules.
Yeah. So really make sure that you are not going to kill the system that you are deploying. So have a standalone system, synthesize it from VM or bare metal, and play with it rather than using something like your own laptop. Okay, anything else that you came across at this step that you want to share? Anybody?
Cool. Let's move on to the POC.
Okay. So the next phase is POC. So do you want to take? a stab at that?
So basically, as kind of mentioned earlier, the domain name. You've already heard us talk a lot about domain name and the importance there. If you are going to be in an environment where your domain name and your production and your lab environments are the same, and the workstation that you use to access both environments is the same, then that can cause some of the challenges. Where that becomes the challenge is in the PKIs. As Dimitri had mentioned earlier, the CA that gets auto-generated by IDM, the DN is essentially a default to the domain or the domain name of IDM that it uses, plus some other information. You can actually override that during your IDM installer, and one of the things I would recommend doing is override that DN to be something like IDM lab environment as the DN for the CA certificate. That way, when you go to production, you do IDM production environment, and you're guaranteed there's no collision of the DN for your root CA of IDMs. Even though the domain names are the same, the DN subject is kind of the important component in that one there. When you're in the testing, the DNS configuration by default, and we kind of talked about using forwarder, setting it up. If you don't have forwarder set up for IDM to go and communicate with, it actually tries to go out to find the root domain servers. So some environments don't allow you to get out to the root DNS zones, so that it will try and do that one. But NTP is also another critical one. Time is very critical for Kerberos and a lot of those components. One of the things you may discover if you're in a virtual machine is random number entropy may run out for you because there's several operations that are pretty taxing from a cryptographic perspective of installation. So in many cases, you may find random number generator daemon, which is a component you can install in your guest VM to assist you in allowing for greater entropy generation and assist you in your POC. Whether or not you wish to use that in production, there's debate, so whether or not that's a good idea, but in your POC, that's a very viable choice for you.
So there are to piggyback on that, there are multiple things that you need to decide at the installation time or before the installation. As you type the server installation command, there are several things that you like forks on the road that you need to decide whether you're going to do chaining, what is the name of your CA, what is your UID range, how wide is the UID range, and so on. So I guess the recommendation is become familiar with what you can provide as a part of the installation of the command line, what are the parameters, what they mean, and make decisions which ones are really needed to be provided at your initial install. Because some of the things can't be undone.
And some of the components can't be installed later. So if at install time you just choose not to do DNS, you can't come back later and then say, add my DNS. What you can do, however, is say, I'm not going to use the DNS component of IDM. That's fine. And just not leverage it, still use your external stuff, point your client to the other one, but you will need to configure them. However, also be aware that when you join a system into IDM, IDM will auto-join that host into the DNS configuration that it has, so the SSH host fingerprint information will now be in its DNS and so forth. So maybe in one respect it may be easier to have your DNS environment point to IDM as a DNS slave. So it acts as a slave to DNS from IDM and does not put that DNS load directly on IDM and so forth.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, DNS is extremely important, and figuring out the hierarchy and relationship of DNS zones and where and how the host names will be constructed. That's kind of a big decision, architectural decision that you need to make. And if, for example, if your hosts are inside Active Directory domain, then you will have all sorts of different challenges. There are some ways of dealing with them, but this is like a first stumbling block that you will face if you have like Linux systems directly connected to Active Directory and you want to use IDM for trust. So we'll see what that means. So what are the recommendations for the POC? Do you want to run through that?
So as we kind of mentioned here, use a unique DN for your IDM server in your configuration. That does simplify the browser collision of the CA. What's really interesting is the very first time you see that error message, it's rather perplexing, especially because there is no override button whatsoever. You may then have to go into the browser's certificate database and try and clear the cache information of the certificates, and that still may not work. So now you're down at the file system level trying to look, and you know, many times, and when I ran into this one last, it just proved to be a whole lot simpler to spin up a new browser profile and be done with it, and just assume that that other one was just lost, because the PKI component was very difficult to back out of in that respect. But if you use a unique DN for your prod, your lab, it simplifies that one tremendously. Installing a replica is a suggestion in your POC.
Or couple.
Yes, exactly. You're not going to run IDM in production with just one server. I'm at least not assuming you're going to in today's world. IDM by default is a master-master replication. It does not support master-slave. It does not support read-only replication. It's master-master only. And each node is 4 nodes of connection. So each IDM server can connect to 4 other nodes for replication, and it's a total of 60, right?
It's total of 60. Well, the recommended number of connections is 4. It's like up to 4. It doesn't mean that you can't go more than 4,
yep.
But this is the recommended way of connecting replicas between each other. So we recommend 3-4 connections depending upon your needs.
And as you add more nodes into this, I mean, this, you know, the back end is LDAP. And if any of you are familiar with LDAP replication, the more nodes you have in your LDAP replication topology, the more chatter that it will generate for itself and the more traffic. So be cognizant of that and, you know, be mindful, you know, as you go through on that one.
Yeah, so effectively look at the core features that you want to get out of the system when you are going through the POC. Test the server installations, test the replications, topology, clients, basic functionality like single sign-on, like SSH, like host-based access control, sudo, all these things that the system provides. Give them a try, configure them, make sure that they work the way that you expect.
Yeah, so probably one of the first things you'll do there is many of us have been in environments where we, you know, using our SSH keys to log in. So we're used to distributing our keys to a lot of hosts or putting them onto the central NFS server for our NFS home, stuff like that. IDM can manage those SSH keys for you. So that'll probably be one of the first things you'll want to put in there. But be aware that when you use that to log into a remote host, you don't have a Kerberos ticket enabled on the other side. So you'll still need to do a KINIT if you then want to do single sign-on, you know, forward from there. And that's actually, you know, the first time you see that in operation is pretty neat. SSH into the box, KINIT, and then any other IDM client, you're no longer prompted for your password so long as your Kerberos ticket is valid, you know, to go through the environment. So that's something to think of. And also as you start to do your POC, you'll maybe, around the policy side of things, maybe start talking into the security teams. You can start talking about how, you know, once you disable a user in IDM, that SSH key is now disabled everywhere. Or you can revoke the key from IDM, and that SSH key is no longer useful anywhere. So if you have a key compromise, you can pull that out, and so forth. So those are things that security teams want to pay attention to. And as I was kind of saying earlier, many of the times that the sticking points have often been things external to the technology, you know, the policy and so forth. And IDM does touch in a lot of those areas.
Okay, we need to move forward a little bit faster. So during the POC, not only just trying things, but also understanding what is possible. Mm-hmm. And understanding, like cleaning the terminology that is being used. And like SSO, what does that mean? SSO doesn't mean that you reuse password against multiple different services. It means that you authenticate it once and access different services using some kind of token. So the system gives you Kerberos. It gives you Kerberos-based single sign-on. So understanding what it is and understanding that when you have Active Directory environment, your Active Directory environment has Kerberos, and your Linux environment is going to have Kerberos. And if you're going to use trusts, what does that mean and how single sign-on works in this case? You really can do a lot of, you're logged on Windows system, and then you, without re-authentication, access your Linux infrastructure. You can do that. This is what the SSO gives you, but you need to know how to configure it, what are the prerequisites, and DNS is a big, big part of it. And if you have some problems with DNS, some of those single sign-on workflows will not work. So we here in identity management assume that you want the best possible experience with SSO. So we are focusing on providing you the best possible ways of connecting your infrastructure. So this is how the assumptions of the system built, but that doesn't mean that they match your environment. So this is where the disconnect might be. We want to hear from you. We want to understand where we need to adjust, and we also want to make you aware of our assumptions here. That's why we're talking here. Moving forward, Red Hat has a stock offering with POC. So if you want to take advantage of that, you can purchase a consulting 1 week or 2 weeks. But
they're often 1 to 2 week assignments. You know, we'll go through a lot of the components. We'll mentor you in the process, and by the time we leave, we will basically you'll have much of the knowledge necessary to continue forward in your POC and be successful in what you're doing.
Okay, so moving forward to creating a production deployment. So there are several things that you need to decide about your architecture, and you need to have architecture of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and you need to answer a lot of questions. So one of the things, in addition to DNS, PKI stuff, NTP that we talked about before, here are other things that you need to think about. Sizing of your deployment. You have multiple data centers, you have multiple clients, you have multiple applications. Some of them are chatty, some of them are not. How many do you need? What is the topology? So you need to figure that out. The next thing is sorting long and short usernames. So traditionally in the like NIS environments or early LDAP environments, you can use your short name because people like bake your short name into the scripts or just used to using short names. When you get into the multi-domain, multi-realm kind of scenarios, fully qualified usernames, domain names are a requirement. So what does that mean? What is the impact? Where you're going to sacrifice it? How you're going to overcome it? There are ways of dealing with it, but it sticks out, and you need to be aware of that. You need to be prepared to deal with the fully qualified names. Host names and DNS, you need to make sure that if you want single sign-on done properly, then there are rules about how the DNS zones need to be built, and thus how the hosts need to be named. So you need to sort that out, and if you can't rename your hosts, which is in many cases in fact the case, then there are some limitations. So you need to understand what are the limitations, what are the sacrifices that you need to make or will have to make in this case. When you deployed things, you will have multiple components talking to each other over different protocols, Kerberos, LDAP, and so on. And those components would need to have tune-up for your environment, because we come with the defaults, but we don't know how big Active Directory groups are. So some things might be timing out, and you have, like, you try to authenticate first time and it fails, and it takes half a minute because it just times out. And then next time you try, everything is fine, everything immediate, because things cached. Yeah, but what happened is something failed and timed out, and then the second thing timed out, and then the second thing timed. There is a chain of components talking to each other. So tuning those parameters is important. Load balancing, the clients in Kerberos and LDAP are capable of failover and load balancing by themselves. So please don't introduce any special load balancing between the client, the Kerberos LDAP clients, and the servers, unless you have a special use case and bring it to us. We will talk about that and validate.
Many times customers will say, well, I want my SSS configuration to be simplified. I want to point to one single VIP. And so that's why they think of wanting to put things behind a load balancer. One of the things that by default the SSS uses, a entry underscore SRV is what it will look like in the config file. Essentially, it will go query DNS, it will pull the list of IDM servers, and then it will maintain a list of the IDM servers and the connectivity to those servers. So when a server goes offline, SSS already knows which one to talk to and so forth. And also the other thing that's important too is SSS is going to try and communicate with the IDM server that is most appropriate for it to communicate with, depending on where it is in the network and the congestion, the time to get to the various servers. So your VIP may be making an assumption from a central location or a central point in your data center that doesn't take anything into account of what your actual network load may be or a VPN link latency may be and stuff like that. So in addition, as we mentioned later on, we'll talk, there's the other components you would need to put in there for Kerberos to work with load balancers. Essentially, please don't.
Yeah, and then last thing in this list is you architect things, so you look up information, you read documentation, you read blogs, you read references, you talk to people, and then you start architecting things. Mm-hmm. And if you came up with the architecture that nobody else did ever, there might be challenges because nobody did it ever, right? So if you find yourself in the situation when you are trailblazing, it's better to engage us as early as possible. So an example with the load balancing, one of the customers a couple of weeks ago, it was like escalation through the roof. By default, by the policy, everything is going through load balancer. They just made this decision at the beginning of their deployment. And they didn't know about the Kerberos limitation, well, not limitations, but assumptions, and that identity management is not recommended in the load balanced kind of scenario. So every system had load balancer, and there was a mess with this, and they were on the path to production, and very pressing timelines, and we had to help and resolve this issue and help to find a load balance solution. So we found it, but it was a fire drill. We don't want fire drills for you and for ourselves. So let's get engaged earlier rather than later. So there are slides for each of those. There are blogs. There are questions that you need to ask. So for sizing, there is a good article in there so that you can determine how many replicas you need and how to split them across multiple data centers. Pictures taken? Well, you will have slides. Yep. You will have slides. So questions to ask: number of system, pattern of use, like how chatty are the clients, what is the application integration, how many data centers. So this is the input into a pretty simple formula that is described in the article. So with the short names, we talked about the reasons for the short and long names. There are some ways to overcome and deal with the fully qualified domain names. Starting 7.4, you can have multiple suffixes configured inside SSSD on the client so that it would try to guess in a specific order. So,
but be careful, you may end up denial of servicing yourself in the other realms that you may be member of, because it will try your account in that realm, doesn't work, keep trying in the other one, doesn't work. Just like in anytime you may saved a password in a system that constantly tries to log in for you, you may lock yourself out of places that you don't want to be locked out of. So be cognizant of that hierarchy and search order.
Yep. So the host names, we talked about the host names.
Notice how we keep coming back to DNS many times.
Yeah, so if you have your hosts inside Active Directory DNS zone, you are pretty much sacrificing single sign-on from Windows side into those Linux systems. So this is what is not going to work. You can augment it with SSH keys, with some other way of authenticating, but this part is not going to work. So this is the limitation. This is the blog post that talks about the details. There is a reference to a more technical article on freeipa.org about the reasons and underlying technologies and why things are this way. So you can make things work, sort of. It will be a complicated setup. So there will be a lot of things that you would need to do in your configuration on the clients to explain to them that the Kerberos principle is really not going to match their host name. So to do that at scale, some kind of post-configuration using Ansible or some other tool is recommended. So another thing that we wanted to talk about is the post-install tune-up.
Yeah, so the one thing to also note is when you're using Ansible and stuff like that, the IPA client installer will use its components. You may need to add other pieces later. So be aware of using your configuration management in this environment. There are aspects where the installer may want to do something one way, your configuration management may want to deploy a template. The two of them will collide with each other until you've kind of sorted that out. So there are places where configuration management may step over some of the configuration utilities in there. But that's something to work through in your POC. Once you've figured out what template works or what kind of configuration works and how to get to there, then templating may work for you in the production environment. But in your POC initially, try and keep the configuration management of the authentication components disabled until you've determined how you're going to design those configuration management pieces.
Yeah, so things like that, you won't see them in your POC because in POC you have the full control of your DNS inside the zone. But in production, you will see challenges like that, and you would have to do something at scale. So we are working on helping you in this area through some Ansible roles that will become available in future, so that you can, for example, drop a couple lines into the Kerberos configuration file on the client and tell the system that these are the Active Directory servers, and only these are the Active Directory servers that the system should be connecting to, and not trying other systems in other parts of the world that are firewalled and not accessible. In the audience, I see people who experience that and would appreciate that kind of functionality being there. So DNS, again and again. So questions at the path to production. So
I think we've pretty much covered that.
Yeah. So you can use your DNS. You can use IDM DNS. You need to become familiar what benefits of each. So there is a way of using the system, the records, the server SRV records generated by IDM when you install a replica. You can run command IPA DNS update system records, and it will give you the system records that need to be provisioned into an external DNS server. So see the upstream docs. It's not documented feature yet, but it is available in help for IPA and this command. So you can take a look at that. Moving on, so we talked about DNS. Let's talk about discovery and failover. So this is the article that talks about Kerberos and LDAP protocol and how all the components get involved and how they're interacting and where the timeouts can be and where the delays can be and where the issues can be and what needs to be tuned to be tuned there. Okay, moving forward, load balancing, don't do that. We talked about that. PKI, when you need to finalize your decisions about chaining, about use of CA and sub-CAs, about the DN of your CA, so that, because these things are extremely hard to change after you deployed your system.
And another couple other things to also note is you're going to want to set up, you're going to want to replicate your CA to at least one other machine. So at least you'll have two systems in your environment that are CA master servers. Also note that if you installed it on IDM1, let's say, as your first installation, and you got 2, 3, 4, and 5 now, but IDM1 gets deprecated, the configuration will still point to IDM1 as the master CA server, so you'll need to update the internal configuration so that now another one is designated as the CRL server, essentially, is kind of the component, or the master server that actually issues the certificate. And that's also especially critical if you were to have your certificate expire and the first IDM server is no longer there and you need to renew the certificate. It can cause for some interesting pain points for you. And also be aware too that IDM does not necessarily track the expiration of the CA certificate, so that's something you'll want to maybe put into a calendar to then renew and so forth.
So we'll talk about that in a couple seconds, but the root CA is for 20 years or something like that, but all the other the key expiration. But for the rest, the IDM actually tracks things, but if you lost the first server, then and not assigned the tracking responsibility to some other CA, then you lose the tracking and certificates might expire or will expire, and then parts of the system will stop functioning in some obscure and unclear ways. And you will be fighting a symptom, not understanding what's going on. But really what happened is your certificates stopped working. And so we talked about that. So day 2, we just talked about the certificates and the expiration of the certificates. So make sure that if you lost your first server, you explicitly assigned the responsibility for tracking the certificates in your environment. So replication is another thing that people face frequently. So if you lost your replica but haven't cleaned information about this replica, then other replicas still think that it is available and start building the change logs for it. And you can run out of space on the systems. So, and suddenly things stop working and you don't know why it's not working. Well, because you ran out of space. So clean things. Don't just when you lost something, you need to clean up the rest of the environment to make sure that there is no information about this replica inside the environment. So starting 7.3, there is a different kind of the domain architecture, the replication architecture. So there was a change, and it is an important change to know about. Before 7.3, replicas knew only about their peers. There was no global knowledge of the whole topology. Starting 7.3, there is every single replica knows about the whole topology. The whole topology information is replicated across. So that allows us to do some analytics about preventing you to create fragmented graphs where you tier a replication agreement in the middle and you get to isolated portions of your environment. So, and that has a promise of more analytics around your environment down the road. So upgrades. We had a lot of issues with 7.4 upgrades. Who hit the issues with 7.4 upgrades in the audience? Okay. So the issues were related mostly to two things. We had significant changes under the hood of how we do delegation model, and the upgrades were tested with the assumption of the default configuration. But when things manually change, the permissions on the files manually change, some settings in different configuration files manually change, and what we have seen is that in some cases the upgrades failed with that customization. So the bottom line here is, with the upgrades, try them with a copy. Try them aside in the lab before you just blast out and say, okay, next version of RHEL is in there, just for the sake of safety. Migration is another thing. Very quickly running through that, you need to run RHEL 7, and if you want to move from one environment to another, introduce replicas into existing environment and rotate replicas out of that. So that's the recommendation, but you need to pay attention to several things when you're migrating things like that. CRL tracking, certificate renewal, these are the things that needs to be reassigned, as we talked about, and people forget about it. Also, UID space fracturing. The replicas have their own UID ranges, and they trade those UID ranges. And if you remove replicas or lose replicas, those ranges go with those replicas. So you need to recover those ranges explicitly, and you need to know that at some point something might start failing because it can't assign UID, GID anymore because this replica ran out of the UID range. So it's fixable, but you need to be aware of that.
Yep.
So also there is UID range for Active Directory users that you need to be aware of and pay attention to. Don't run mixed environments for the long period of time. Do the phase rotation in days rather than in months. Troubleshooting is very important. It's like, if something goes wrong, we're here to help. So we provide a lot of information, knowledge-based articles. If you find the exact symptom, follow the article. If you don't see the exact symptom, rather than going under the hood and trying things yourself, open a case.
You may also run into a scenario, too, where you may think that you're looking at an error message, and essentially it was a piece of, a warning message from the development cycle that didn't get pulled out for whatever reason. That does happen on some occasions, and so you're going down the road of what you think is the error. You're going to go fix it, and you're actually now going in the wrong path. So it is good to look under the hood and have a look at what's going on, but please be careful when you're doing that, because IDM, as Dimitri's going to say, we treat as a black box in terms of how you manage it. So if you start going under the hood to fix or change things, you may risk yourself later on as you go through.
Okay, so when you open a case, it is really helpful to understand your environment. And there is sometimes no continuity between the cases and conversation with you. So somebody in consulting did the deployment, or you did the deployment, and then you open a case. We don't know the details of your environment. We ask for it. So keep it. Have this documentation available and attach it to the cases. If you have a TAM, he will track it for you and will help you. If you don't have a TAM, we need this information because different people get involved in handling the cases and helping you, but they need context, and this context needs to be provided. So the more information you can give us when you open the case about your environment, about what you have done, what are the steps to reproduce, and what are the problems you are facing, the better and the faster the service will be. And this is the summary. These are the links that might help you And we are here to help and answer questions. And again, for the round table from 1 to 3 in Moscone South in room 308. Thank you.
Thank you.